Ever find yourself like endlessly scrolling through news on your phone, but then you realize you haven't actually, read anything?
Oh, absolutely. It's like our brains go on autopilot. We're swiping and tapping, but are we really absorbing any of it?
Right. It's this weird paradox of being hyper-connected, but also kind of mentally checked out.
Mm.
And that's what makes this deep talk so interesting, right? We're really digging into what actually gets us to engage with news on those tiny screens.
Because it's definitely not the same as, say, sitting down with a newspaper.
Not even close.
Ugh.
And for this deep dive, we're looking at some excerpts from a study. Let me get this right. It's titled News Reading on Smartphones. How do mood, modality interactivity, and news story length influence news engagement?
Catchy title, right?
Definitely grabs your attention more than my usual scrolling habits. But don't worry, we'll put a link in the show notes if you want to check it out for yourself.
Yes. Please don't feel like you have to memorize that.
But the gist is this. The study looked at three main things. First, how long those news articles are. Then there's how we interact with them, like scrolling versus swiping. And, get this, they even looked at our mood while we're reading.
And to make things even more interesting, their test subjects were 330 college students.
Okay, so we're talking about a generation that practically sleeps with their smartphones.
Pretty much. Though I'm guessing they weren't scrolling through TikToks for this research. They had them read articles about viruses.
Viruses. Well, that's a cheerful way to spend an afternoon.
Right. Specifically Zika and West Nile. I guess they figured those were topics that would be, relatable to a younger audience, but not overly emotional or anything.
Nonsense. Keep those emotions in check for the sake of science, right?
Right.
But, okay, I got to ask, how do you even study the impact of mood in this kind of setting? Do they, make the happy group watch a stand-up comedy routine beforehand?
Well, not quite. But they did manipulate the participants' moods before they started reading.
Okay, spill the tea. How'd they do that?
So before diving into the news, they had each student spend a few minutes writing about a really happy event from their life, or in the other group, a really sad one.
Interesting. So tapping into the power of memory to, really put them in a specific headspace?
Exactly. And it worked. They actually checked, made sure that the people who wrote about those positive memories were in significantly better moods afterward than the ones who focused on, well, the not-so-happy stuff.
Clever. So we've got our mood manipulation. We've got smartphones at the ready. Time to unleash the news. Now, I'm particularly interested in this whole article length thing because, honestly, my attention span for mobile news is 2 sentences max. Did they find that those longer articles actually held people's attention on a tiny phone screen?
You and me both. I feel like my scrolling thumb has a mind of its own. But here's the thing. They did find that longer articles were seen as more informative.
More informative, really?
Yeah, but, and this is important, there's a catch. Remember how we talked about them messing with everyone's mood? Well, that's where things get really interesting.
Longer articles are more informative, but there's a catch. Come on, you can't leave me hanging like that.
Well, it all ties back to mood, believe it or not. The people in the study, the ones who are in a good mood, they actually found those longer articles more, how did they put it? Yes, usable?
More usable. That seems a little strange. Wouldn't being in a good mood make you want to, zip around more? Looking for shorter, snappier things? At least that's what I feel like doing when I'm happy.
It does seem counterintuitive, right? You'd think we'd be all about that quick hit of info when we're feeling good. But the way the researchers explain it, it's when we're happy and scrolling, we tend to skim more. We don't really do the deep dive reading thing as much.
So it's kind of like ignorance is bliss. If you're just skimming, those longer articles are less intimidating, maybe.
It could be. Think about it. You're relaxed, maybe waiting for a friend, just scrolling without thinking too hard. That longer article, it doesn't feel as long because you're not actually trying to read every single word, are you?
Okay, yeah, I can see that. But then what happens when we're in a bad mood? Because surely nobody wants to scroll through a novel on their phone when they're feeling down, right?
You'd think not, would you? But you're onto something there. The study found almost the opposite was true. A bad mood meant that shorter articles were the ones people found more usable. Our attention spans shrink even further when we're already down in the dumps.
Wow. It makes you wonder if that feeds into that whole doom scrolling thing. Remember a couple of years ago when it seemed like everyone was glued to bad news?
Oh, absolutely. It's like a vicious cycle. Our mood makes us more drawn to those shorter, often more negative news bites. And then, of course, reading a bunch of depressing stuff just reinforces our bad mood. Not the best recipe, really, is it?
Definitely not. So to recap, We've got mood and article length all tangled up. But what about the way we actually interact with all this news on our phones? Does swiping beat scrolling or vice versa?
Right. I mean, everyone talks about swiping like it's this magical thing, right? The cool modern way to interact with, well, basically everything. But when the researchers looked into it, here's the thing. Swiping was only more engaging under very specific circumstances when people were in a good mood, A&D, reading longer
Wait,
articles.
hold on. Are you telling me it's not as simple as swiping is always better? My world is crumbling.
It's more nuanced than you might think. For short articles or when people were in a neutral or negative mood, good old-fashioned scrolling actually won out in terms of engagement. Who knew?
It's like our brains are running these super complicated calculations in the background, juggling our mood and how the information is presented. Who knew something as simple as scrolling versus swiping could make such a difference?
Right. It just goes to show the format of information really matters. It's not just about the information itself, but how it's presented to our brains, how we're interacting with it, and even, apparently, our mood at the time. It's mind-blowing when you think about it.
It really is. It's like context is king. Even for something as seemingly basic as reading news on our phones, this is seriously giving me a whole new outlook on my, shall we say, enthusiastic scrolling habits. But, okay, there's one more layer to this whole thing, right? They didn't just look at engagement, did they? They also looked at how people judged the news they were reading, right?
Totally.
Totally. They dug into how people perceived the news itself. Like, did they think it was credible, timely, or even biased? All while, in the throes of scrolling and swiping.
And get this. Remember how we were saying that people in a good mood tended to find longer articles more usable? Well, guess what? They also rated those same articles as both more biased and more current. Talk about a head scratcher.
Wait, more biased and more current. How does that even work? It seems like those two things should cancel each other out, shouldn't they? Like if I think something's biased, wouldn't I be less likely to think it's super up-to-date?
You'd think so, wouldn't you? It's kind of a paradox. But it might just prove that our brains go a little softer on things when we're feeling good.
So like when we're in a positive mood, happily scrolling through those longer articles, we're less likely to really question what we're seeing.
Exactly. It's like our inner skeptic takes a little nap or something, which is kind of wild when you think about it. It's like those clickbait headlines, the ones that hook us in when we're feeling optimistic and just scrolling without a care in the world. We don't always stop to think, is this for real?
It's like we're more easily swayed when we're feeling good, even if the information is a little, shall we say, suspect. So, what's the solution here? Should we, throw our phones in a river and get all our news from carrier pigeons from now on?
As tempting as that sounds, probably not the most practical solution. It's all about awareness, right? Just paying a little more attention to your state of mind when you're scrolling through news on your phone. Like if you're feeling stressed or a bit down, maybe take a beat before you get sucked into those shorter, often negative news bites. Those can actually make your mood worse.
So if you catch yourself doom scrolling, maybe step away from the phone for a bit, clear your head.
Exactly. And if you're in a great mood, just cruising along, enjoying those longer reads, maybe take a second to double check the source or see if there are other perspectives out there. Just a little something to keep in mind.
It all comes back to being our own fact checkers
Right.
and being more aware of what's going on inside our own heads, especially in this world of 24/7 news and endless notifications. Which, speaking of, makes you wonder.
Mm-hmm.
This study focused on news, but it really gets you thinking.
Doesn't it? What about all the other stuff we're consuming on these things all day, every day? I mean, think about it. Social media, those never-ending work emails, even just, texting with your friends. Do you think our mood and how it's all presented changes how we experience those interactions too? Something to ponder, right?
Absolutely. It's like our phones have become extensions of ourselves, but we forget they can subtly shape our thoughts and feelings. Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Hopefully you've learned a thing or two, or at least, started questioning your relationship with your phone a little bit.
Here's to being more mindful scrollers. Until next time.